Welcome back to the Convo Couch, everyone. Pasta Jardula here. And we have a very special guest for you today. Today we have a guest who's frequently on Crosstalk on RT, on Press TV. He's an expert at Russian foreign affairs. Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos is here with us today. How are you doing today, Doctor?
Hello, Craig. And can I say how delighted I am to be on your show? So thank you very much for having me on.
It's our pleasure. We see you on Crosstech quite a bit. We love your work. We love your political ideology and what you talk about and your straight up reporting. So let's just jump right into it because we got some great questions today. As you know, we just returned from Nicaragua from observing those elections. We scrutinized them to the T, and they were quite good, to be honest with you. I wish in America we had the same system. We might actually get some real democracy. But this is something you tweeted just the other day. You said Stalin once described Latin America as the obedient army of the United States. Ortega is a concern for the U.S. because under him, Nicaragua, along with Venezuela and Cuba, allows Russia to have a very important foothold in Latin America. My question to you is this, Doctor. Is it more to the American imperialism other than just Russia being in the backyard? I mean, doesn't resource extraction and the implementation of the monetary system via the IMF hold just as much weight?
When we analyze what is happening in Nicaragua, we have to consider the geostrategic dimensions to this, namely the colossal amount of tension which is in existence today in the world between America and Russia. Tension which revolves around NATO expansion in Eastern Europe and the Baltic, an expansion which was very clearly told to Mikhail Gorbachev in 1990 by George Bush Sr. and James Baker would not occur in return for the Soviet Union consenting to German reunification. Indeed, let us remember the words of James Baker at the time, which he emphasized on more than one occasion to Mikhail Gorbachev, namely, not 1 inch eastwards, not 1 inch of eastwards expansion will occur. Now, turning to Nicaragua, well, America's policy on Latin America has been governed since the 19th century by the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine, despite what American politicians and mainstream journalists today say, remains very much intact. Indeed, John Bolton, not so long ago, said of the Monroe Doctrine that it is alive and well in 2021. Now, what we have to take into consideration in Latin America is that Russia is looking to resurrect its Soviet-era influence in the continent. Why? Well, to counter America's dangerous presence along the entire western border of the Russian Federation. And the Russia of today is able to look to Latin America because it is, again, a superpower because of the leadership and policies of Vladimir Putin. And in regard to Nicaragua, or in regard to Venezuela, or in regard to Cuba, Stalin's famous quote about the continent, that it is the obedient army of the United States, is as pertinent today as it was when the Soviet leader made the comment. Because despite what is happening in Nicaragua and Venezuela, and to a lesser extent in Bolivia, Latin America is overwhelmingly in the orbit, in the sphere of influence of Washington's. But nonetheless, in recent years, Russia has regained a foothold in Latin America. And specifically, I'm talking about Venezuela. I would describe Venezuela today as how Cuba was to the Soviet Union during the Cold War, namely Moscow's eyes and ears in Latin America. But also Russia, as a result of Daniel Ortega having returned to power in 2007 in Nicaragua, also has a foothold in Nicaragua. And of course, that is the cardinal reason as to why the Americans are claiming electoral fraud in the recent Nicaraguan elections, because they know very well that Nicaragua is rapidly reestablishing the relationship it had with Moscow during the 1980s. Now, that's not to say that the Russia of today has the global influence and power that the Soviet Union had, because that is simply not the case. However, it is the case that the Kremlin does wish to, is seeking to emulate the power that it wielded during the Cold War. But with Daniel Ortega in power, that means that Russia has another foothold in Latin America, as it does in Venezuela, as it does in Cuba, as it does still in Bolivia. So that is why the Americans are homing in now on Nicaragua. But at the same time, it is abundantly clear to anyone who is wholeheartedly impartial when analyzing Nicaraguan politics that Daniel Ortega is an extremely popular politician. Indeed, the Sandinista party is an extremely popular one, and it has been ever since the 1980s. And there are a number of reasons for that, but one of them is that the Sandinista party has been very successful in combining Marxist-Leninism with Christianity, with patriotism. And that appeals to a great many people in Nicaragua, not just from the working class, as I said, from devout Catholics to patriots to people who subscribe to Marxism-Leninism. So Daniel Ortega is an extremely popular politician. Because of him, Russia and Nicaragua are developing close political, economic, and military relations, which is, of course, good for Russia, but also it is very good for Nicaragua, as it has been good for Venezuela, and as it was extremely good for Cuba during the Cold War. And quite frankly speaking, I found it remarkably ironical for Joe Biden to make the accusation that the Nicaraguan elections were rigged, given the tremendous amount of evidence which indicates that Joe Biden's election victory was actually more down to electoral fraud than it was to democratic measures. But then again, since when has any American president been truly committed to democracy? I have long said this on television. I have long said this in speeches, that if America was sincerely concerned about democracy and advancing the cause of democracy, then it would not have a strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia, which doesn't have 1 ounce of democracy in it.
It's funny because if elections changed anything, I think the politicians in America would outlaw it. And, you know, one might even argue that the United States, with their imperialism and supporting the coup, actually pushed Daniel Ortega and the Sandinista government closer to Russia. I, for one, think that a coup attempt in 2018 is what led to Daniel Ortega's landslide victory, because when you're in Nicaragua and you're even talking to people who are for the opposition, they still want America out. They don't want America involved. And also, I want to build upon what you're saying about the Marxist-Leninism thing. It's all economics. Their social entities are all economics. It's about building roads, giving electricity, healthy water, healthy food, education. You know, when it comes to the social issues in Nicaragua, they're a lot like the conservatives and the Trumpers in the United States. You know, they're very Catholic, they're Christian, they believe in free speech. They're not going to legalize marijuana right away. They're not going to support gay marriage. But all their socialism seems to be involved economically, and that's what a lot of people like. It's all about economics. They even have an autonomous region in the northeast Caribbean part of Nicaragua, which we visited, where they have their own judges and their own mayors and stuff, and they make their own laws. They just support. They rely on support from the national government when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to emergencies like the hurricanes that hit them. Daniel Ortega's government would show up right away, the Sandinistas, to help these people out. And that's why he's so beloved in that country. But my next question to you, Doctor, is the fact that what does this mean now? What type of role will Russia play in Nicaragua when it comes to economics, but also militarily wise? Because we understand that they can support them by giving them, Navy ships or planes, whatnot. But when it comes to Nicaragua, their greatest threat comes from within inside. The U.S. Supporting regime change. How is Russia going to help Nicaragua in that aspect?
Well, first of all, Moscow's approach will be twofold. Firstly, to assist the Nicaraguan economy, which is absolutely vital in preserving Nicaraguan independence and sovereignty against the cancerous tentacles of Washington's, and at the same time assisting the armed forces of Nicaragua, which of course will be equally essential in keeping at bay the cancerous tentacles of Washington's. And I believe that Russia's approach to Nicaragua will be very similar to the Soviet Union's approach to Cuba during the Cold War, and also modern day Russia's approach to Venezuela, whereby there will be a tremendous amount of economic assistance given to Nicaragua to keep on improving the economic infrastructure in the country, to enable the Nicaraguan economy to keep on exporting its produce, to being able to import very important goods, which are absolutely essential for the ordinary man and woman in Nicaragua. Also, at the same time, assistance from Russia economically will help to preserve the health and education systems in Nicaragua, which have achieved great lengths, especially when compared to their equivalents in America. And when it comes to the armed forces, well, undoubtedly, we will see Nicaragua purchasing a lot of Russian-made equipment, from tanks to helicopters to naval vessels to aircraft. But at the same time, Russia will be asked by Nicaragua to help modernize existing equipment in the Nicaraguan armed forces, equipment which goes back to Soviet times. So though that twofold approach from Russia will be absolutely crucial. If we take Venezuela, under Hugo Sanchez and under Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela on their own achieved a great deal, but without the political and economic and military assistance of Russia, it is more than conceivable that America could have succeeded in orchestrating a coup in the country, which would have brought down, for example, Nicolas Maduro a couple of years ago. But because of the tremendous amount of support that Russia has given to Venezuela, including during the attempted coup by Washington, it meant that Venezuela prevailed. And I believe that the Kremlin will look to do exactly the same in Nicaragua, because even though Daniel Ortega commands great support from the Nicaraguan people. Nonetheless, not far from his country is a global superpower, an economic superpower, which simply cannot be challenged economically. We hear from some commentators that China is economically challenging America. Well, China is, to the extent that it wants to become the largest economy in the world. But that doesn't mean it will be the most powerful economy in the world. Let us not forget that America, along with Britain, of course, is the center of the global banking sector, is the center of the global financial sector. So Daniel Ortega and the Nicaraguan people, they need the support of a very powerful friend and ally, and more than just a very powerful friend and ally, a friend and ally that comes in the form of a superpower. And that is why Russia's relationship with Nicaragua will be imperative going forward.
It's crazy because you think the American empire would learn that they're not going to go around and bully everybody. Maybe try a different tactic. Maybe try to do things the way China does. Hey, let us come in there with your infrastructure. Let's find a way. I mean, Nicaragua is already tied to the American dollar. So is Peru and all these other countries. So it's like maybe try a different way instead of scoffing and standing over your neighbor to the south. It is crazy. But with all this said, Doctor, do you think that the Americas is going to try another coup and try it maybe quickly before Nicaragua continue to build relationships with Russia and arm themselves where they can protect themselves? Are you expecting maybe a quick lightning strike?
I think that is extremely plausible. I believe that the Americans are looking at the relationship between Nicaragua and Russia as one that is in development at the moment. It is not like the relationship with which Moscow enjoys with Venezuela. So now is the time for Washington to strike in the form of a coup in Nicaragua. Will it be successful? I have to say that because of the tremendous support that Daniel Ortega has from people of all different backgrounds in Nicaragua, combined with the relationship which Nicaragua enjoys with Russia, I believe that if America looks to initiate a coup in Nicaragua, then the Nicaraguan people will be able to withstand it. But my word, the Nicaraguan government, along with the Russian government, have to be exceptionally vigilant, because the Americans, as I said at the beginning, look to Latin America as their domain, as they have done since the early 19th century, an approach which is governed by the Monroe Doctrine. They are absolutely adamant in looking to ensure that not one foreign power has any form of a foothold in the continent. And whilst most of Latin America is more than compliant to Washington, indeed, it is subservient to Washington. Nonetheless, there is Venezuela, there is Cuba, and there is Nicaragua. But yes, in short, I believe that it is very plausible, more than plausible, that the Americans will look to orchestrate a coup in the country sooner rather than later.
It scares me because America has this, if you don't comply, then nobody will comply. This kind of take my ball home, nobody's going to play. And I'm very fearful that they'll somehow manufacture consent, try to destroy the infrastructure there somehow, and then to walk away for a little while and then try to regroup and get back in. And that's my biggest fear, is if the fact that they can't get a foothold in Nicaragua, and that seems evident right now, that they'll do something to try to destroy the country and sweat them out, just like these sanctions. There's no such thing as targeted sanctions, like Ro Khanna said. It's bullshit. It's just going to hurt the most vulnerable people and the poorest people in the country. You did mention Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, right? Those three that are kind of together, that John Bolton described as the I think it was the trico of tyranny of something. The trico. What's the word? The trico of tyranny he describes. But there are other potential allies in the region. On the 28th, Honduras has their elections coming up, and Xiomara Zelaya, the wife of Manuel Zelaya, is running. How important is that election on the 28th in Honduras for the people and the government of Nicaragua? I mean, how badly are they rooting for Xiomara, and why?
Well, again, that is a country which has a lot of poverty. That is a country which the United States has long used, has long abused, has long exploited, and has used an intimidating approach towards. But if the people of Honduras want to create something new for themselves, if they want to bring about greater social justice for the ordinary man and woman in the country, and when I say social justice, Craig, I don't mean in the neoliberal way that we hear being spoken about in America and in Britain, or what is more commonly known as today the woke definition of social justice. No, I mean true social justice in the form of free education, free health, a good education system, a good health system, whereby people are not going to be afraid of losing their jobs. They're not going to be afraid of the scourge of homelessness. If the people of Honduras want that, if they want to preserve their country's independence and sovereignty, then they need to look very clearly and very carefully at those candidates which openly call for Honduras to not bow down to the diktats of America, or indeed any other country in the world. But of course, when we talk about Honduras being threatened by a foreign country, it can only be the United States. So if there is an election result in Honduras, which is very similar in its outcome to that of Nicaragua, then of course you will see Washington start to pile the pressure on Honduras, because it all comes down to the Monroe Doctrine. Only the United States is allowed to be present in Latin America. No other country outside of Latin America is allowed to be present there. And also Washington, since the 19th century, whether there has been a Democrat or a Republican sitting in the White House, has exploited Latin America, has exploited it politically, but in particular economically.
It's crazy. I still think that America, if they still want to have the influence in Latin America, they need to change their ways. It's a different time. It's a different day. And what we saw in Nicaragua, the people are ready to stand up and fight for their freedom no matter what. Let's get into Belarus, because there's a lot of stuff going on there. But I want to first digress to the elections, Lukashenko's last election, Mr. Alexander over there, because it's kind of funny. The West accused Daniel Ortega of eliminating his political opponents, jailing them, exiling them from the country. And he also claimed, and we have the receipts for this too as well, so he wasn't lying, that they had foreign influence there aiding them and funding them, like the NED, whatnot. Alexander Lukashenko kind of faced the same types of criticisms from the West. Is it legit, his election? Did those things really happen? It was a little bit different than Nicaragua? Or did he have a lot of reason to get rid of some of those people the way Daniel Ortega did, who were taking money from these nefarious groups like the NED?
Alexander Lukashenko has been president of Belarus ever since 1994. And since then, which is nearly 3 decades, the West, America, Britain, the European Union, and NATO have condemned Lukashenko as, quote, a dictator. But There is a reason for them calling Lukashenko a dictator, namely that under him, Belarus, or its historical name, Belarusia, has remained a very stable country. Indeed, because of Alexander Lukashenko's presidency, Belarusia never experienced the catastrophe that Russia under Boris Yeltsin experienced during the 1990s as a result of the shock therapy economic reforms which Boris Yeltsin presided over, which resulted in terrible, terrible hardships being experienced by the ordinary man and woman in the Russian Federation. It resulted in mass privatization of Russian industry and Russian natural resources, and it meant that Russia became dependent on America, and specifically on loans from the International Monetary Fund. But the same was not true in Belarusia. Alexander Lukashenko opposed the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and under him, Belarusia has maintained a state-run economy. It is true that without subsidies from Russia, the state-run economy would have encountered some very serious problems. But nonetheless, Alexander Lukashenko has kept Belarusia very stable country. Indeed, Belarus is one of the most stable countries in Europe, where people have jobs, people's salaries are paid on time. There is no homelessness in Belarus, as there was no homelessness in the Soviet Union. Crime is remarkably low there. And of course, Alexander Lukashenko has presided over a welfare state which was inherited from the Soviet Union. So the West has never been able to achieve a foothold in Belarus, partly because of Alexander Lukashenko's policies. But at the same time, I have to say to you and to your audience that Belarus is de facto a part of the Russian Federation. The armed forces of Belarus are de facto a part of the Western Military District of the Russian Federations. Belarus and Russia are only two separate countries on paper and paper alone. Indeed, both countries since the late 1990s have been part of what is called the Union State of Russia and Belarus. And the idea of the Union State, or the idea behind the Union State, is for there to be a full official merger between the two countries, whereby they will become one, officially become one. And as a result of the West's attempted coup in Belarus last summer, following President Lukashenko's emphatic victory in the elections there, which were genuine. Why? Because Lukashenko is very popular amongst the Belarusian people, because he has preserved stability in Belarus, because he has preserved jobs, he has preserved salaries, he has preserved the welfare state, he has preserved pensions, he has overseen a society where there is little crime and no homelessness. So Lukashenko is extremely popular, but as a result of the West's attempted coup, which failed and failed abysmally in the summer of 2020, this has inadvertently increased the speed upon which Belarus is integrating with Russia, because the Kremlin is very conscious of this, that whilst the chances of a Western coup succeeding in Belarus are negligible, and they truly are negligible, because as I said, Belarus is de facto part of Russia. Nonetheless, nothing can be ruled out. And the Kremlin is not going to make the mistake that it made in Ukraine at the end of 2014 and the
They
beginning
were
of
asleep then.
2014. When
They were asleep at the wheel for the Ukraine situation. You can see now, the attitude is totally different.
They truly were. And as a result of that, the West instigates the coup in Kiev in February of 2014. Now Russia faces the diabolical situation of Ukraine not just being in the West's sphere of influence, but the West making plans for Ukraine to enter NATO. So whilst the chances of a Western coup in Belarus are negligible, nonetheless, the Kremlin is looking to speed up the process of integration between Minsk and Moscow. And as a result of that, the world will be witness to a new country when Belarus reunifies with Russia. And as a result of the union state of Russia and Belarus materializing, this will boost tremendously Russia's national security in both Eastern Europe and the Baltic region. So that is why the West is using the migrants on the Polish-Belarusian border as a pretext to increase NATO's presence along the Russian frontier, and also to target Lukashenko again in order to try and foment civil unrest in Belarus, in the hope that this will assist them in their objective of initiating a coup in Belarus against Lukashenko to wrestle Belarus from Moscow's orbit into the West's sphere of influence. As I said, that will not happen, Craig. However, Russia will not take any chances, and that is why we are seeing the union state of Russia and Belarus materializing very, very quickly.
I got to say, too, as well, I think the Russian attitude is completely different, especially since Joe Biden's gotten in there. Once he got in, they started acting up in Kiev again and trying to force a little kind of situation on the border over there in the Donbass region, saying that Russia was being aggressive again. And then when the United States threatened to move aircraft carriers into the Black Sea, the Russians were like, I don't think you want to do it this time. They were very stern. It seems like a different Russia where they're not going to back down and give an inch this time because of the mistakes that happened in Kiev. But let's stick on, before we get to the Russian the Polish-Belarus border situation with the migrants, I want to push back a little bit, because we did have a situation where Lukashenko said he arrested some Russian people that were there that were trying to plot a coup of sorts in Belarus. Remember that whole situation? And we did see a couple weeks of protest after the election. Unlike in Nicaragua, where the youth love Daniel Ortega, there seems to be some pushback against Lukashenko in Belarus with these protests. No?
Well, not every single Belarusian man and woman supports Lukashenko. Indeed, if anyone was to make that argument, it would be more than fanciful. It would be preposterous nonsense. It would be absolutely ludicrous. So whilst the majority of the Belarusian population support Lukashenko for the reasons I outlined earlier on, nevertheless, there are some who oppose him. And those people took to the streets in Minsk in the summer of 2020. However, those ringleaders of those protests were in the pay of Washington and London. These were people whom, like their counterparts on the Maidan in Ukraine at the end of 2013, the beginning of 2014, had been trained by American and British special services in Poland and Lithuania. They had been trained not only in how to protest, but also how to protest in a very Western savvy way. So that is what the danger was facing Belarusia in the summer of 2020. But the protests that we saw in, for example, Minsk were minimal. They did not attract the thousands upon thousands that CNN or BBC News or Sky News claimed. That was not true. But it was true that some people took to the streets because they don't like Lukashenko. But those who were heading the protests were a fifth column of the West. And that fifth column was attempting to replicate what the West succeeded in doing in Ukraine in February of 2014, namely orchestrating a coup, an anti-Russian coup in the country. So yes, naturally, there are Belarusians who do not like Alexander Lukashenko. They took to the streets, but the people who planned it, the people who were heading those protests were agents of both Washington and London's. And we must never ignore, or we must never play down the role of Britain in, for example, Nicaragua or in Ukraine, or when it comes to Belarusia, because Britain and America act in unison. Both countries are the center, as I said earlier, of the global banking sector, of the global financial sector. They are the heart and soul of NATO. They are the heart and soul of the Western world. They act together, and people, even though the size of the British armed forces is very small today, nonetheless, Britain's global influence and power is absolutely enormous. And if we really want to be specific, well, of course, we have to refer to the city of London when we talk about Britain's role in the world.
Yeah. Well, let's get to the situation on the border. And I think the EU seems to have, I guess, a little bit more ability, a little bit more power in Eastern Europe than the United States does in the global South, because in the global South, they're just starting to fall on their face. The Cuban protest that was supposed to happen the other day was almost non-existent. So it seems like they're really losing their grip here in the global South. Let's talk about the situation on the border right now at Poland and in Belarus. Where are the migrants from? How many are there? What's going on? Give us everything you got, the geopolitical ramifications, why this is Vladimir Putin's fault, according to the West. Tell us what you know.
Well, first of all, there is only one migrant crisis plaguing Europe, and that is a migrant crisis, which is in its 10th year now, courtesy of America, Britain, and France, having destabilized both Libya and Syria through having supported Islamist terrorists in both countries. As a result of Washington, London, and Paris having destabilized Libya and Syria, in excess of 1 million migrants arrived in Europe. And let me be abundantly clear about something, Craig. They were not refugees who arrived in Europe. They were migrants. Most of the people who arrived, for example, in Europe in 2015, close to 1 million, were not Syrians. They were not Libyans. They were people either from sub-Saharan Africa, or they were Afghans or Pakistanis or Iraqis. So that there is a migrant crisis plaguing Europe is very much the case. But who caused that? The West caused that. If we now look at what's happening on the Polish-Belarusian border, we see a few thousand migrants there, from anywhere from between 2,000 to 4,000 migrants, some of whom from Iraq. Those people are not refugees, they are migrants. They are looking to improve their lives. They're looking to improve the lives of their families. They're looking to have more prosperity in their lives. And they took the decision to try and enter Europe via Eastern Europe. Because, of course, the migrants who entered Europe, or who have been entering Europe for the last 10 years, have been entering via Southern Europe, for example, through Italy and through Greece. And from Greece, they came from Turkey. So the migrants on the Polish-Belarusian border thought that they were trying to enter Europe from a different way. So that is why they are there. But it is quite ironic for America, Britain, the European Union, and NATO to say that they are alarmed by migrants on the eastern frontier of the European Union and NATO, when they had no compunctions about allowing well over 1 million migrants into Europe over the last 10 years, many of whom bring with them values which have nothing in common with European values. Many of them are criminals. Many of them are would-be terrorists. Many of them bring with them a terrorist ideology. I'm not saying every single one of them do, but many of them, that is certainly the case. And of course, mainstream media in Britain and America, in Germany and France, will not report the very many acts of crime that these migrants have committed since they arrived in Europe. For example, the rape of women, the rape of children. So quite frankly, I don't care what the West has to say about the migrants on the Polish-Belarusian border. Those people on the Polish-Belarusian border were looking to improve their lives. We don't know who they are. Some of them, as I said, will be genuine in wanting a better future for themselves and their family members. Others, we don't know what sort of people they are. But the West doesn't care about what sort of people enter Europe, because if they did, they would never have allowed well over 1 million migrants to arrive on the continent. But of course, the situation on the Polish-Belarusian border serves a purpose for Washington and London. Namely, it allows NATO to make the argument that Russia and Belarus are threatening the stability of Europe. Therefore, there needs to be continuing increases in the NATO budget. There needs to be an increase in NATO soldiery and weaponry in the Baltic and in Eastern Europe. NATO needs to keep on integrating Ukraine militarily. And also NATO needs to keep on increasing its presence in the Black Sea, because Russia is threatening Europe. Russia is behind the situation on the Polish-Belarusian border. And Craig, if you were an American or British policy maker, you would use any opportunity before you to demonize Russia even further and look for another reason to increase the West's presence, or more specifically, NATO's presence in Ukraine and in the Black Sea region. And as I talk now, NATO is rapidly increasing its presence in the Black Sea region. It is refurbishing the Ukrainian ports of Odessa and Ochakov to accommodate American and British warships. Why? That is another way of integrating Ukraine further and further into NATO, and it also allows the Americans and the British to challenge Russian naval supremacy in the Black Sea. So the West doesn't care about migrants. The West doesn't care about the rule of law. The West doesn't care about mankind, but it will use any opportunity before it in order to keep on building the media and PR case against Russia, and to also build the case for further NATO expansion, which of course I'm referring to Ukraine.
Okay, so pretty much what you're saying is that the EU is saying that Belarus is being inhumane, allowing these migrants to suffer at the border and not come on in, and they're just being awful. Is that the kind of the sentiment that the West is playing right here by putting it on Belarus via saying, and Belarus, Lukashenko is just a puppet of Putin, so at the end of the day, it's Putin's fault? Is that the gist of what you're saying pretty much?
Well, that's certainly the narrative of both of Washington, London, and Brussels. But if the West wants to truly, sincerely analyze and account for why those migrants are there in the first place, then they need to recognize that it is their destabilization of North Africa and the Middle East which has caused the migrant crisis, which is plaguing Europe. It doesn't have anything to do with Russia. It doesn't have anything to do with Belarus. It doesn't have anything to do with Putin or Lukashenko. There is a migrant crisis, and that is because of the policies of the West. And what are 2,000 to 4,000 migrants on the Polish border compared to well in excess of 1 million migrants who entered Europe and who were allowed to enter Europe by the Americans and the European Union as a result of the catastrophic policies that the Americans pursued in both Libya and Syria?
Well, let's digress also to your comment about migrant versus refugee, because if they come from Syria, if they come from Libya, if they come from Iraq, to me personally, I don't think it's a difference between calling them a migrant and a refugee, because we've blown up half of the country. We've destabilized their economy, so they have to go seek a better place to live. And, you know, I don't want to say that the comment that you said that some of these people coming in are criminals sounds a little bit like Donald Trump, but that's what Donald Trump did kind of say. You know, there's going to be a couple bad apples, whatnot. My question to you is this, Dr. Papadopoulos: how do we solve that issue? Because yes, of course, there's going to be some bad people that come in, but the majority have got to be people who we've destabilized their region, and we should have to be responsible for them coming here or coming to Europe, because it was us who's destabilized that country. So how do we solve that problem when they do show up at the border of Belarus and Poland, when they do show up at the southern border of the United States? I mean, we did cause the problem, and I like the fact that we do concentrate on the initial problem, what's causing it. But when they get here, how do we take care of that and not just demonize all of them the way Donald Trump did?
Well, we have to remember that most of the migrants who have been entering Europe over the last 10 years are not Libyan, nor are they Syrian. One only has to have a look at the Greek-Turkish border to see for themselves that they are not from Libya. They are not from Syria. They are not from Arab countries. Most of them are from sub-Saharan Africa. Most of them are from Afghanistan or Pakistan. Very few of them are actually Syrian. Yes, some of them are certainly Iraqi. But again, who destabilized Iraq? Well, it wasn't Russia. It wasn't Belarus. It was America and Britain. And yes, there are people who left. There are Syrians who left the country because of the conflict, which was instigated by the Americans and the British, and of course the Turks and the Israelis and the Saudis. But most of those Syrians, Craig, are not in Europe. They're in Turkey. They're in Lebanon. And to a lesser extent, they are in Jordan. That's where most of the Syrian refugees are. Most of the Syrian refugees are in the three countries which I have just cited. They are not in Europe. And whilst I am not, again, saying that all of the in excess of 1 million migrants who entered Europe are not all criminals or extremists or would-be terrorists. A great many are. And it is especially the case that many of them will bring values with them to Europe which are totally alien. Some of them will bring ways with them which would horrify the ordinary person in Europe, would horrify the ordinary person in America. That's not racist. That's not generalizing. That's a matter of fact. And that is why there have been so many cases, criminal cases, where migrants have committed deplorable acts in countries such as Germany. But the way to stop the migrant crisis is by the West ceasing in its endless attempts to enhance Western global hegemony at any cost, at any price. That is why there is a migrant crisis. That is why there are so many Syrians in Turkey, in Lebanon, and in Jordan, not because they want to be in those countries, but because they were forced to flee because of a war that was initiated by the Americans, the British, the French, the Turks, the Saudis, and of course, the Israelis. That is why they are in those countries. But of course, Europe has to do something about the migrant crisis. It has to defend its borders, but I don't see them defending their borders in the south, where Italy is, for example, like how they're defending their border in Eastern Europe. So it is a very depressing situation. It is a very disconcerting situation. Winter is now here. The weather on the Polish-Belarusian border is very, very cold. There are children on the border who need to be looked after. But why are they there? They're not there because of Belarus. They're not there because of Russia. They're there
I agree with
because
that.
of what the West did in Iraq.
I agree with you there too, and I can talk to you for hours about the situation, because I would even add to the fact that some of the behavior they have is because of the dictators we put in charge in those countries, so we can control for resource extraction and whatnot. But I'm going to give you one last question to get you out of here. Daniel Ortega is now going to go on his fourth term in a row. He'll have power for almost 20 years. Vladimir Putin's been in power for quite some time. We talked about Alexander Lukashenko now, who's been in control since 1994. There's an argument, a nuanced argument, that these particular politicians or particular leaders are holding on for power too long. What do you have to say to that there? I mean, I know in our Congress, we don't have a term limit thing, and Nancy Pelosi's been in there since God knows how long, and Chuck the Schmuck Schumer. What is your pushback to people who say, well, these leaders like Lukashenko, like Vladimir Putin, like Daniel Ortega, are holding on for power too long, and they need to let go to the next person?
Well, on the one hand, Craig, I would say that in both America and Britain, there is a permanent unseen government there. It doesn't matter if there's a Labour or Conservative Prime Minister in Britain. It doesn't matter if there's a Republican or Democratic president in the US. The policies remain the same. The methods remain the same. And on the other hand, I would say that it's down to the people of Nicaragua, it's down to the people of Belarus, it's down to the people of Russia to decide who they want to lead them. And if the likes of Ortega, Lukashenko, and Putin are delivering the fundamentals to the average man and woman in their countries, for example, a free and high quality health and education system, if they are ensuring jobs, salaries, pensions, welfare, and social justice, then people will keep on voting for them. But at the same time, when it comes to Russia and Belarus, the societies there are very different to the societies in the Western world. And there is no reason why they should be like the societies in the Western world, because in Russia and in Belarus, people there, they want a strong leader. That might not be to the taste of American and British neoliberals. That might not be to the taste of the rancid woke movement in the West. But quite frankly, it has nothing to do with them. It's none of their business. Russians and Belarusians value a strong leader. And that means that the average person in Russia will have the fundamentals. Because when Russia has had a weak leader, then there has been catastrophe there. So there was catastrophe in Russia as a result of Nicholas II, Tsar Nicholas II, being weak and ineffectual. There was catastrophe in the Soviet Union as a result of Gorbachev being weak and ineffectual. And there was catastrophe in Russia during the 1990s as a result of Yeltsin being weak and ineffectual. It is absolutely imperative for Russia to have a strong leader, whether that be a Tsar, a general secretary, or a president. That is what Russia requires. And no one in Russia cares what these neoliberals, what these woke imbeciles think of them, because Russia needs a strong leader. And it is none of the business of the woke movement or neoliberals in America or in Britain as to how Russia is governed. And when it comes to Nicaragua, the Nicaraguan people enjoyed free and fair elections. They took a decision to re-elect Daniel Ortega because he has provided the basics for the average man and woman in Nicaragua. And at the same time, he has ensured Nicaraguan independence and sovereignty, and he will not bow down to the diktats of Washington. And because of that, I salute him, and I salute the Sandinista party.
And it was an intriguing conversation today, Dr. Papadopoulos. I want to thank you for coming on in. Please come on again. We'll have some more conversations. Tell everybody where they can find you, and we'll get you on out of here.
Well, let me say again, thank you very much, Craig, for having had me on. I've greatly enjoyed our discussion. It was a very open, a very candid one, which I believe is absolutely imperative when we're talking about freedom of speech. As regards where can people find me, people can find me on Facebook, on Twitter, and also on YouTube.
Perfect. That's it for the Convo Couch today with Dr. Papadopoulos, Pastor Jardula, Johnny Sue on the ones and twos. We'll see you on the flip end. Convo out.